to be here.
I'll start if everyone's okay. So I just want to say thank you first for being here on such a cold and snowy week, um, and just a busy time of the semester. I just am excited to share a piece of my dissertation work that was made possible by the pre-doctoral award from El Instituto. Um, the title of my work is Familismo is a double-edged sword, an exploration of a culture of stress, cultural values, and well-being among Latine university students. So just to give a brief overview of my presentation today, I'll be starting with an introduction about myself and kind of positioning myself in my research. I'll review the literature that informed my work, and then we'll set the stage for the present study. Then I'll go into sharing more preliminary findings from my work, and I'll provide some key takeaways and implications for research and practice. And then I will go into some more UConn focused findings because, as I'll discuss, I talked with UConn undergraduate students who identified as Latine. And then I'll go into some of my next steps with my dissertation work that's informed by this current work. And then finally, at the end, we'll have a discussion with some question and answers. Um, I just want to grab my water, sorry. Oh, I forgot about that. So before I begin, I just wanted to give a little more context about me and my positionality. So I was born and raised in the Bronx, New York. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And in terms of education, I received my master's degree at UConn in HDFS in 2022. And now I'm a PhD candidate in the department. Broadly, my research, or generally, I'm interested in applied research that benefits communities and informs change, and also work that is informed by culture and developmental processes. And that's just a broad explanation. So before delving in, since Latina identity is very relevant to today's topic and El Instituto in general, I want to share a little bit more about my Latina background. So I am Puerto Rican. My mom was born in Ponce. So I grew up visiting a lot and I still have family there. Unfortunately, I don't speak Spanish, and I think that was part of which came up in my findings too, but kind of the notion of my parents were worried that English or should be the priority, I guess. And I still have a little bit of resentment towards that, but that's okay. So I really like this picture. It was me and my sisters and my mom in my grandpa's home in Puerto Rico. So this was the backyard, and there were some wild horses. I think I'm the one on the left. I have a twin sister. We always go back and forth, like which one is which? But I'm pretty sure I'm the one on the left. Um, so the reason why I'm also sharing this piece about my identity is because as a researcher, and especially in qualitative work, it's important to kind of be aware of who I am and the role that it plays in the process and the results of my research. So just keeping that in mind, I just want to acknowledge that I'm consciously aware of how these parts of my identity might come out in how I'm presenting the work, or because it is a personal topic to me and it's important. And I'm happy to answer any questions about that towards the end in the Q&A. So yeah, so now I'll continue on to kind of give a background of the literature that has informed my work. So 1 in 5 college students in the US identify as Latine, and this number is just growing. And sorry. So keeping this in mind, I want to provide some developmental context, and I know there's a lot of HTFS people here. So just kind of delving into the period of emerging adulthood. It comes with a lot of transitions, such as like forming new relationships, navigating new roles and responsibilities. And then thinking about this stage might be especially challenging for Latina students because they're adjusting to the majority culture of the university while also kind of navigating their own identities. So this is also important because research shows that while there is this growing number of Latina college students and they're more likely to be the first in their families to complete college, there's still these higher dropout rates of Latine students compared to their peers. So some of the things we'll be talking about can kind of maybe address why we see these things happening. And in regards to well-being, which I will also be addressing in the coming slides, Latine college students are at a greater risk for anxiety and depression, which is already pretty prevalent in the period of emerging adulthood or in college students. Um, so moving on to some more literature. So we kind of want to think about what Latine students might be experiencing that in their environments, socially and culturally, that place them at a greater risk for compromised well-being, and maybe might explain some of these higher dropout rates in the university setting. So acculturative stress might be one factor that can help explain this. And acculturative stress can broadly be defined as the stressors stemming from the acculturation process. But the way that I like to think about acculturative stress is kind of these everyday stressors that you would experience living in like a dominant culture that's different than your own, while also kind of balancing these different norms and values. And then for Latine immigrants, this might be related to experiences of discrimination, stressors around language, whether that be English or Spanish proficiency. And it could also be the feeling of being disconnected from one's own country of origin. So another kind of cultural factor that might play a role in the adjustment of Latine emerging adults are cultural values. So cultural values, I'm sure some of you might be familiar with this, but they're just shared beliefs, traditions, and social norms that shape behaviors, identity, and relationships. And then some of the most commonly studied cultural values that I'll be alluding to the majority of the presentation and that were relevant to my work were these listed here. So Familismo is the emphasis of close ties with the family. Respeto is respect for others, especially elders and authority figures. And then there's these machismo and marinismo, which is those gender roles, kinds of cultural values. And then lastly, feudalismo is the value that's kind of associated with religion or religious beliefs, so that the belief that there's a higher power or a God that is kind of determining your destiny or your future, kind of things like that. So moving on to a little bit more literature. So now that we know what a culture of stress and cultural values are, we can kind of look at why a culture of stress, or why it's important and how it affects well-being in general. So these are, I'm not going to go into too much detail with these, but these are some of the areas that I'm looking at in terms of well-being, and they are informed by the literature. So a culture of stress has been linked to negative adjustment, including depression and anxiety, somatic symptoms, which are specifically important for Latine populations because of the stigma around mental health. And that did come up in my interviews with students too. And then also it's been associated with hopelessness. And some of these links are also have also been shown to occur over time. So kind of like that longitudinal effect. So with an attempt to kind of move away from a deficit approach, I kind of wanted to frame it more as hope, because hope is a key factor in well-being for Latine college students. Um, so So yeah, just before I get into some of my specific research questions, um, I wanted to make some important points around cultural values and a culture of stress that kind of revolve around the idea that the Latine community is not a monolith. So we should be cautious about kind of how some of these values, or just the concept of a culture of stress in general, might perpetuate stereotypes and kind of make it seem like there's a one size fits all approach to the Latino community. So for example, some of the literature has said that respeto can be helpful in certain contexts, but it might lead to the portrayal of the Latine community as submissive or complacent in other contexts. So it's really critical to think about some of the historical or colonial roots of the research and some of these concepts while we're going through this. And it also is the reason why I wanted to talk to students directly. Um, so yeah, all this to say, oh, sorry, I skipped a little part. I just wanted to say also that acculturative stress, not all Latinos or the Latina community experience it the same way. Um, and without going into too much detail, there's also some measurement and conceptualization issues as well with acculturative stress. And I'm happy to talk about that later too. But yeah, all of this to say that there's a need to kind of hear directly from Latina college students rather than assume the values that they endorse and the types of stressors that they experience as most like salient to their well-being and to who they are. Um, so moving on now into the present study, I'll start with the research questions that guided my work, and then I'll go into more details of the sample. Um, so, so here are the research questions that guided my work, and you don't have to memorize them. I'll kind of go through each of them again as I get to those points. But to answer these questions, I conducted semi-structured interviews with Latina college students at UConn. And so basically the first question is kind of getting at what are the aspects of acculturative stress that are most salient to Latina college students. And my second research question is what cultural values do they really value or endorse? And then how, kind of to tie it all together, how do they describe those values in the context of acculturative stress and how they think it affects their well-being? Um, so So moving on to methods, as I mentioned, I'll give some more background into the recruitment strategy, the data collection and analysis. Yeah, my goal for recruitment was 20 participants and I met that goal. So yeah, the recruitment eligibility was for students to be between the ages of 18 and 25. And I said that so either they or their parents were born in a Latin or South American country, so first and second gen students. And then they had to be enrolled at the University of Connecticut. So I used purposive sampling, which basically means that participants who had experienced these key concepts that I'm interested in exploring were intentionally included. And because UConn kind of has this unique structure where there is a main campus and several other regional campuses which have different populations, I believe, Karen, you said Hartford is an EHSI.
Yeah, I think it's an emerging HSI.
Okay.
Hartford and then Stanford and Waterbury are HSI.
HSI, designated HSIs. And Storrs obviously is a predominantly white institution. Um, so I also I kind of targeted all campuses. And then I used snowball sampling. So at the end of the interview, I asked students if they had anyone in mind that they think might fit or be interested in sharing their experiences to share that. And then also I posted an announcement in the UConn Daily Digest. I shared the flyers with student cultural centers and different departments and student organizations and clubs. And maybe some of you in this room might have heard from me to share the flyer. And then I also asked professors that I knew from each campus to kind of share the flyer with students that they had in their classes. I think that's that. So moving on to what did the students actually do during as part of my research study? So as I mentioned, I conducted semi-structured interviews, but I tried to focus on narrative. So I intentionally tried to have it be more participant-led rather than me coming with a list of questions and just reading off of them. But I did have an interview protocol to stay kind of organized. I covered some topic areas, including some of them on the screen. So family life and values, university life, culture, stress and well-being, the role of cultural values, and then current sociopolitical climate. Um, I have an example question. So one of them was, have you ever felt stress or pressure from trying to balance different cultural values or expectations, like at home versus at school or with peers? And can you share what that was like for you? Um, I also, in the interview protocol, I had a cultural values ranking activity. So I shared my screen and I presented a slide, all of the 5 cultural values that I mentioned earlier. And I had them take a few moments to rank them 1 through 5 based on how relevant or important to them. And I kind of left this open so they could kind of share what they believed was important, or they could share what their family kind of practiced, or what um, their family valued. And that, but I did have them walk me through their thinking and kind of detail and go through each of the ones that they ranked. And then lastly, I had some vignettes of hypothetical Latine students. So these just had different kinds of cultural values and a culture of stress dimensions, and just kind of different situations. And I mostly use those at the end in case I felt like students um, were a little stuck on the topic in general, or just kind of have them think of it from another person's perspective if they had trouble thinking about it for themselves, for like what they had been through. Um, but yeah, I'm also happy to share more about what was on my protocol at the end or at another time. Um, so then moving on to the sample characteristics. So I completed the all 20 interviews in the summer and fall of 2025. Uh, so there was total of 20, as I mentioned. So they ranged from 45 minutes to 90 minutes. So as you can see, the students really cared about what they were talking about. And I would say they averaged about an hour or so. So um, the transcripts, the interview transcripts were cleaned and organized. So I can move on now to demographics. And I know this is a lot of information, so I won't be presenting all of it, but I'll try to kind of go from the left to the right to kind of highlight what I think is important. As you can see, a majority of the sample was female. Uh, the mean age was 20 and the age range was 18 to 24. Most students were from Storrs, and then the second largest group was campus change. I labeled it as campus change students, so students who had been to 2 or more campuses. I think I actually had one student who actually went to 3 different campuses, which was interesting. And she had a lot to talk about with that. And then, so the class year, a majority of the students were second and fourth year students. And then moving on to Latine identity, I just want to make a note that there's no percentage because a lot of the students fell into multiple categories, especially if both of their parents had origin in South or Latin American country or Central American. Um, but yeah, some of the countries that were mentioned were Guatemala, Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, Brazil, Nicaragua, Honduras, and Costa Rica. Um, and then, uh, yeah, so interestingly, there were 7 students who their primary language was Spanish, and yeah, most of the students were second gen students, so they were born in the U.S. and their parents were born outside of the U.S. And yeah, just so I have some other information if you're interested about employment, and at the end I have some other demographic information if anyone's interested. So just to kind of give a background of what my preliminary analysis looked like, I identified a subset of 8 transcripts kind of based on demographics that included gender, the campus that they came from, whether they were first or second gen, and then kind of overall the rich description of the transcript itself or the interview itself. And I did line by line coding and reviewed these codes to kind of identify patterns based on those 3 research questions that I shared earlier. So moving on, I can start presenting some of the good stuff, which is the findings. So I've organized the findings by research question. And as I share the findings, I'll discuss like an overall finding, but then I'll share some specific quotes from students to kind of illustrate the finding, but I just want to make an important note that these example quotes are just examples and they don't make up the entirety of the finding. And I also want to make a note that I removed some of the filler words from some of the quotes. And in some cases, the quotes are long and I'll try to summarize them. And in other cases, I'll give you a moment to read them if I feel that the quote is powerful and we need some time to read. So as a quick reminder, so the research question 1 was focused on finding out directly from students what aspects of acculturative stress are most salient to them and represent how they feel. So yeah, as expected, kind of, the students reported different forms of acculturative stress that were included but not limited to language-related pressures. So that could be the pressure to speak Spanish or worries about their accent in Spanish, being made fun of for not speaking Spanish or vice versa, like not being able to speak English well. And then bicultural stress, which is kind of the balancing of different cultural expectations. Another one that came up was challenges related to belongingness, whether that be in the majority culture or their own family's culture. And then inculturative stress, which is kind of the pressure around maintaining one's family culture or language or practices. And I just have 2 examples to highlight some of these. So the first one is highlighting a student who's kind of getting at bicultural stress. So they're sharing that they sometimes feel like they're not white or American enough, but then they feel like they're not Latina enough in other settings. So she's describing feeling like she's in some weird middle ground. And then this other example at the bottom shows enculturative stress. So this student, he's expressing fear that his culture is going to die or disappear because he felt like he's not able to pass it down to future generations. And I also want to highlight that that's part of the reason why he said this was because a lot of his family still lived outside of the US, and I'm forgetting which country it was, but that was why he's feeling like it's kind of all on him, but he doesn't feel ready to kind of pass down the culture. Um, and I also wanted to make a note that several students, although not in the subsample of 8, they also shared that they didn't experience a culture of stress. But interestingly, they sometimes said they didn't, but then would describe instances that kind of fell into one of these categories. So that was interesting. Uh, so moving on to this next big finding related to research question 1, are kind of the stressors that came up for students around feelings around the social political climate. So yeah, I want to say that although like this is again from the subset of 8, I would say these feelings were apparent in all 20 of the interviews, I would say, especially having negative feelings around the ICE raids and deportations, the federal government defunding. Some students were expressing worry about even finding a job after graduation because of what's going on. So I do want to give everyone a few moments to just take the time to read these quotes because to me they are quite emotional and powerful. So yeah, I'll just give you a moment to read that. Well, as you can see, the first student, when reflecting on a culture of stress, was kind of expressing that their stress is not from these everyday interactions with peers or in school, but instead it's the deportations that are going on. And as you can see, they're expressing these very intense physical feelings and just expressing that it's really difficult to act like everything's okay and to kind of function every day. And then the second student is expressing that even as a Puerto Rican woman, she's like regardless of citizenship, they still had fears for their family and the community more in general, and for themselves just based on race alone or skin tone. And I do want to note that these conversations were difficult. And I know, like I mentioned, positionality, it was hard for me to not get emotional during these conversations with students. But it did seem to me that students really did want the opportunity to talk about this more. And I can imagine that this might be the case because of I conducted the interviews over the summer and fall, and since then, I think a lot of these issues have been intensified. So I just keeping that in mind, I think students are in need of like these conversations and yeah, and this space more broadly to feel comfortable to talk about that. Um, so yeah. Uh, okay, so now I'm moving on to findings related to research question two. So this question again is focused on what cultural values let me start over. If the cultural values that are traditionally studied in the literature that I mentioned, are they still applicable to or relevant to students now, and how do they view them or as important, and which ones are more important? So to do that, so the major finding here is that students endorsed all five of those cultural values. Um, for example, the student said it was difficult to kind of rank them, and a lot of students echoed that too. But they felt like all of them were really important to them. And from that ranking activity that I discussed earlier, uh, from that 8 subsample, Familismo, Respeto, and Fatalismo were the top 3 that were ranked as number 1, if that makes sense. So yeah, despite all of the students saying that these cultural values were important to them and to their families, they did express some clashes with certain values, particularly machismo, marianismo, and respeto, because they kind of associated them with more rigid expectations. And we'll get more into this in the following research question, which kind of looks at the cultural values in the context of a culture of stress and well-being. Okay, so moving on to research question 3, which kind of has 2 parts. So the first part is what are the role of cultural values in the context of a culture of stress? And then how are students describing these processes as related to their well-being more broadly? So again, I have the major findings in the colored box and then some example quotes. But the role of cultural values I found can kind of fit into 3 categories that I'll describe on the next 2 slides. But firstly, students described cultural values as supportive in the context of a culture of stress. So for example, this first student on the top left, they talked about fatalismo and familismo, just stating that even knowing that her family was praying for her gave her peace of mind. And then even so an example of a culture of stress that she mentioned was kind of being the only person of color in your class, but knowing that she still had those close connections to her family gave her a sense of support and belonging. And then the student on the bottom left, they also expressed Familismo as a source of support. They said that they can't imagine being who they are without family as a priority in their life. And then kind of the opposite, some students also expressed cultural values that contributed to their stress. So a lot of the students mentioned clashes with specifically like the Marianismo, machismo, the gender roles. And then as you can see in the bottom quote, there also is some tensions with respeto because a lot of students said that respect is earned, but this value kind of assumes that it should just be given. So this student was describing how it has caused strain on their family because a family member was kind of expecting respect, but she felt like it wasn't right. So some clashes there. And I skipped over the top one, but this student was kind of grappling with their gender identity, and they really focused in on machismo and how the expectations that are associated with really cause strain in their family, especially between them and their dad. So then this third category that the cultural values findings fit into is that there are mixed or conflicting views of cultural values. So some students had more of a complex or the conflicted role or view of the role of these values. And as you can see, this is the title where the title of my presentation came from. This student is kind of describing that Familismo has kind of enhanced their feelings of missing home and having more intense feelings in that way. And they kind of also went to say that even though they miss their family, that being away from them actually helps them to focus more at school. So kind of like a conflicted view of, well, it's good and bad. And then the student on the right is talking about sympathia. And I think I forgot to define that one, but that's kind of dealing with harmony in social relationships, even if it means putting yourself last and putting others first. So this student mentioned sympathia and familismo, and they said it makes them feel very strongly and empathetic towards other people, but that this also intensified their feelings around the injustices that are going on. And they said it felt too much and they feel helpless. So as you can see, yeah, in both of these, they're kind of saying these values almost enhanced the feelings, and even if those feelings were negative, especially in the context of the current events and things like that. So then the second part of research question 3 is what aspects of well-being did students mention in relation to occultative stress and cultural values? So similar to what the literature showed, students kind of had mentioned their well-being as indicated by like anxiety, depression, hope, somatic symptoms, and self-esteem. And I can just give you a moment to read these, but they all kind of get a piece of this. So yeah, the first quote on the top left, the student is saying they noticed that a culture of stress has changed their self-esteem, where they're kind of always thinking about what are other people who aren't like them doing and how are like yeah. So that interview focused a lot on self-esteem. And then this student, even though she's aware that it's not healthy, she made a note that she tries to cope by dissociating. And then this student kind of expressed symptoms of depression, so mood depleting, lack of energy, and lack of motivation. And then lastly, this student specifically is again focusing on current sociopolitical events, and they have these intense like physical or somatic symptoms and anxiety. So then moving on to some other important preliminary findings that are outside of those research questions, I wanted to focus on campus climate and pride as the two kind of that were outside of the question, but I think also very relevant to the topic in general. So the first finding around campus climate that I think is important to highlight, given that UConn has, again, like all the different campuses, is that campus climate plays an important role in the experience of a culture of stress and overall well-being. So the first finding on the left side focuses on a student describing how Storrs has really helped them feel more free in expressing different parts of their identity. And this student in particular was referring to their gender identity. And they just noticed that it has overall improved their well-being. And so that is a more positive example of how campus can kind of lead to more like, positive well-being. But the second one is kind of reflecting a different experience. So this student was a campus change student, and they were describing how being just being the only person of color in their class and how they're coping with that. So yeah, so describing how the transition from Hartford to Storrs was really, really a big difference for her. Um, and then another big preliminary finding around campus climate was just that cultural diversity is very important to students. And I know some of this might seem obvious, but this was especially mentioned as a strength of students from the regional campuses. So this student from Waterbury is sharing that they fit in, that they feel safe, and they're just happy because from their high school experience, they didn't have that people that looked like them. But here in Waterbury, they you can be whatever you like, and he can talk to people. Okay. And then next, I kind of wanted to focus on something to celebrate. I know we've been talking a lot about some sad current events and things, but um, Latine pride was very prominent amongst all of the students, regardless of language proficiency or being or generation. So the first and second generation students. Also, this first student was reflecting on not being able to fluently speak Spanish, but she states that she's very proud of her culture, and she never had to hide her from being Latina. And then the second student, it is describing that despite these very strong feelings around the current events and the political climate, that they couldn't be more proud or happy about where they and their family are from. And I think it was really nice to hear students, beaming with joy around like talking about their identities. So then moving on to to summarize all of these findings, so the key takeaways. The experience of a culture stress is clearly like very complex and nuanced. Oftentimes it was intersecting with like or other aspects of identity, as I mentioned, like gender identity, and even sometimes the experience of a culture stress changing over time. So some students felt like when they were younger, it was more intense, and now that they're in university, they're kind of able to cope more with these feelings. Um, so I think that something that's not really captured in the traditional measures of occultative stress is this piece of the socio-political climate and as a key source of stress for students. And I'm finding that these kinds of stressors are also related to adjustment to UConn and to the US in general. And it seems like a strong cultural stressor that's not really captured in these existing measures of occultative stress. Um, so moving on to kind of the summary of the cultural values finding. So research question 2, all students interviewed found that these cultural values were important to their lives, whether it was through what their family believed or whether it was what they endorsed individually. And that the way that these values functioned varied widely. For example, Familismo was often described as a powerful source of support during difficult times, yet it could also intensify pressures related to uh, everyday life or meeting family expectations, things like that. And as one student described, that, yeah, the Familismo can feel like that double-edged sword. Um, And then students also reflected on other values like machismo, mariniso, and respeto, noting how these kind of create rigid roles or expectations that conflicted with their personal values. So in terms of well-being, I think what's important to highlight here is that somatic symptoms and self-esteem emerged as important to well-being, and those, again, are not really prevalent in the research of cultural values in the context of occultative stress. Um, and then the other important well-being indicators were anxiety, depression, and hope. So, uh, so yeah, now I wanted to move on to how these findings can inform research, theory, and practice. So, firstly, around the area of research and theory. So the hope is that this work contributes to research and theory around a culture of stress specifically, and address some of those. I know I didn't get into it, but address some of those measurement and conceptualization issues. And then Also, this work contributes to research on cultural values. And as I mentioned, this is really important because the literature often assumes that these cultural values can be generalized across all Latinos and that they might be all positive. But this, I think, is very misleading. And this kind of gives, talking to students directly gives a perspective that it's not all one clear picture of how these values function. Um, yeah, and another important implication I think is crucial is how can this study inform those who work directly with Latine college students, especially given the times that we're in right now. I think firstly it can provide insight into the processes that can impede or promote Latine college students' well-being in all of those areas that I discussed, and then this study can inform programs that are tailored to the needs of Latina students and improve their overall quality of life and well-being. So kind of to tie into the next slide, I wanted to, because I was able to talk to UConn students, I wanted to give them a little bit more UConn specific findings. So on my protocol, I asked these few questions around that were specific to UConn itself. So first one was what makes them feel safe or welcome at UConn, and then kind of how their Latin identity plays a role in their experience at UConn in these next two questions. Um, okay. And then just quickly to go over some of the UConn preliminary findings, I think that these can fall into two categories. So first is what are students saying are the existing supports and the communities that they already have and that they value. So students I talked to, they really enjoyed talking to me about this specific question. I think they a lot of them, as you might imagine, who agreed to do an interview, they are part of a lot of these clubs and organizations. So this included Perlac, Baile, Lambda Theta Alpha, um, and then as you can see, an LCI, sorry. And then as you can see, this student is saying that even though they weren't part of a club directly, just seeing that they're there really made them feel more welcome. And he was referring to the Peruvian club, I believe, but just really showing that the importance of having these spaces. And then secondly, is this area around students expressing a desire for additional supports. So these students are wanting supports, especially around the current sociopolitical climate and events, and overall just a sense of empowerment from the university. So this first student is saying that there doesn't really seem like a place for letting students have activism, especially for issues that are affecting their community. And then the second student at the bottom is reflecting that they are happy that they saw a student club kind of addressing these issues, but coming from the university, they said that they haven't heard anything at all. So I think that these are kind of areas where, for implications as well for UConn, um, for practice. Um, see. So kind of to wrap up, I described my findings and research questions. I can now kind of explain what I'm doing now. So because I received the El Instituto's Pre-doctoral award, I was able to complete this phase one of my dissertation. And more broadly, my dissertation is an exploratory mixed methods design. So now where I am using the qualitative data that I have to inform a survey. Um, so that's the next step, and the survey is almost ready. So everyone can keep an eye out and share once that's ready. Um, but yeah, I'm really grateful for that, and I'm excited to have all these pieces kind of come together. So and especially the survey, I'm hoping to get at some of those limitations in the research that I mentioned around measurement and conceptualization. Um, and last but not least, I just want to thank El Instituto again for supporting me with the funding to even make this research possible. I also especially want to thank all of the students for sharing their stories and really taking the time to be part of the study. It was so great to get to know them. And I want to give a special thank you again to my advisor, Dr. Kim Fleury Van Leer, who's here, and then my other committee members, Dr. Anna Marie Chismadia and Dr. Maria Lurusso, and for their experience and guidance. And then I know Kimberly's over there, but I just wanted to thank her for doing all of the communication about this award and just hosting this and providing sandwiches for everyone. And I thought that was really nice. And then I also want to thank Vanessa for all your support in just like preparing for this and just in general. Like I know we talked about spaces and communities. I thank all of you from the department for showing up here today and being here. Thank you. We can move on to some question and answers. Yeah.
Wow, there's so much. I'm just bowled over too by the expressive richness of these texts.
Yes.
I don't know where to start. I mean, I'm really glad that you get to the collegiate context because it's so full of countervailing emotions, right? To begin with, from hanging out just a little bit with LCI and Parallax students a few years back, probably still the same. There are these sort of two sorts of narratives. The one, like I grew up in Marlborough and I was the only person who was Latina in the whole Mile High School. And then the other is I grew up in Bridgeport. And this is so different. This is so white. And then the students say, what a blessing it is that we can get together and learn from each other about, what we actually share. And then, of course, there's this issue like, whoa, for a lot of people, you are UConn, like their relatives are like, you've got it made, right? This is your ticket. And then there's a lot of pressure, all that about being like the economic leader of your family. You're going to be the one who's there, right, for others. So yeah, I'm hoping that your research. I'm after saying there's 101 questions, I'm kind of straining to nail down one. But I'm hoping that your thesis will, in the end, be as human a document as what you've shared with us here. Yes. And I really want to celebrate that.
Yeah, thank you.
The one thing that I didn't think was all that perfect was your title. Why Familismo? Out of all these values, did you pick out Familismo as the one to put up there on the marquee?
I think because of that mixed feelings around it. I think Familismo was the one that came up a lot. In terms of like being a sense of support, but also a pressure. And I just liked, I think that kind of captured, the double-edged sword kind of captured that cultural values are not really what we are made to kind of see them as, which I think in the literature kind of paints them in a picture that they are all positive or like that they provide support, I guess, based on what I've seen, but that's what I chose.
Community can kneecap you too. So it's definitely ambivalent.
Yeah. I know it's a small piece of what was said, but that's why I included it as a title.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, please go ahead.
I know like we kind of talked about it, but I don't know. I don't think I've asked this question for like the cultural values. I know you listed them and like asked them to place them in order, but I was wondering, did you also give them the opportunity to potentially include one, or like if there wasn't one like in there?
Yeah, so I should note that before I did the cultural values ranking activity, I asked first about cultural values more broadly to see what they would bring up first. And then I did that to kind of just provide a more like overall sense of the definitions. But I did give them at the end, I kind of said, is there anything that we didn't talk about today that you think is relevant or any other values? And that is often the place where people said different things, but it wasn't in terms of a value. I think what came up a lot was that piece around the stigma of mental health. That was something that a student said to add, which I did later on add to the interviews that came after, but just expressing that in their family, it was really hard to get their parents to kind of understand what mental health even was, or just experiencing that. So that answers your question.
Yeah.
I'm curious about the Marianismo and machismo, and and the fact that the verb you chose was like students endorse machismo, even though they may be conflicted about it. And I'm curious to know, did you give them definitions of machismo and Marianismo? And so you gave them sort of a selection with definitions. And I'm curious about those definitions because, in the United States, machismo is always bad. It's universally negative. But in Latin America, machismo can be positive.
Yeah.
You protect your family, you look out for, you're doing your job as a man.
Yes.
So I'm curious as to how you were phrasing or defining those terms to get students endorsing machismo and Marianismo rather than it's that weird line where you're very American in your values around gender roles in the US, even though you can see your parents reflecting different values. So I'm just, if you could unpack that a little bit more for me.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I tried to, in the definition, so on the slide was all of the values, and then I had a definition and some examples I read as I read them. But I did, in both Marianismo and machismo, say the positive and negative traits or qualities that were associated with both. So in machismo, for example, I said that it can be associated with like confidence or strength. So I did kind of do both sides. And I do want to know, I know it wasn't in the subsample of 8. There were some students who did say like, who didn't have who didn't really have a problem with some of these gender roles. They said like, oh, it's just the way my family is. So I don't think there's a problem with it. It works smoothly. So they didn't, so even though like they endorsed it, it was still part of the list that they ranked. Yeah.
It would be interesting to me too to have a conversation with them about, because you were looking, some of the comments were about, boy, I'm not sure I can pass down all these values. As to, are there ones that they don't plan to pass down?
Yeah.
Right. Because if you see what you perceive to be from an American perspective an unequal relationship between your mother and your father, are you sort of willfully discarding that cultural element in your attempts to pass down what you can?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like that would be an interesting conversation about how they see their own gendered relationships and if they plan to repeat their parental patterns.
Yes, that definitely came up too. I feel like these interviews were very rich. A lot of, especially the female students, mentioned that in their family they grew up with these strict gender roles, and they said they even reflected on current relationships, saying that they are not looking for that in a partner, that they don't want that to kind of be how they live their life. So yeah, that came up too. And I was gonna say one more thing. Or maybe it will come back to me. Sorry. Yeah. Thank you.
I found a lot of correlation between your presentation and basically it almost like I couldn't help but think that your entire presentation kind of just further confirms just how many more Latine students are first generation. Like I was just finding all the connections. I couldn't stop. Like when you were talking about cultural stress and anxiety and depression. Well, on first gen side, it's achievement gap.
Yeah.
Right. And you're talking about I forgot what you mentioned, but then I thought, okay, obstacles and barriers, right? So it just kept kept bouncing between. So I thought that was good. And you actually, I think you even said they were first in college. So they're first of first, really, right? First and first generation. So it's kind of interesting. So that's what I kept kind of thinking about as you were presenting. And so it was great. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. And that kind of makes me excited to kind of delve into this survey, because I think like what you're saying, I can kind of look more closely at somewhat like quantitatively around like first, second generation and see if there's any patterns amongst them.
Oh, yeah.
in terms of like these outcomes. Yeah, thank you.
I can share. Your first grade presentation is
Thank you.
amazing. And I really found it interesting when the student described the respeto part of like I just thought like so Gen Z, like this is just like
Yeah.
new, but it's so much power in like the younger generation, like they speak up, like they're like not like always like accepting tradition. So I just found that part like really powerful in your study, and I echo it that it was so rich. Like all of the students the quotes that you shared were like so impactful and emotional. But the respeto one I think really stood out because they like you see a lot of students that would. They're so passionate and have so much like to say and can bring so much like new to even this like the cultural values, looking at them differently. So
yeah, that definitely came up a lot, and I would say that students were very expressive during these conversations. They were telling me all of their family drama, and talking about how they hate their brother-in-law. So I think it was fun. Yeah. That's probably I appreciate that. Thank you.
Very good.
Yeah,
I'm running.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, I was gonna say, Michelle, they must have felt really comfortable with you, and it must have been like this huge empowering experience for them.
Yeah.
Especially like you were saying, like to be able to express particularly like the sociopolitical current moment, and like you as a doc student, I wonder if that even provided like this new layer and platform of like interacting with the university space in that like sociopolitical, but also overall.
That's the point.
Perspective.
Yeah, they definitely seemed comfortable, and I don't know. I did try to build rapport, obviously, at the beginning, but I think that would be a good space because they were so strongly expressing their emotions around like UConn and what's going on in their lives. So yeah.
Yeah, I was also gonna ask about like the levels of education that you've like you did such a good job presenting so many layers of analysis here, and I thought it was interesting how you presented UConn as like a school and an educational experience, and how the students may have themselves, attributed more power to like. I was wondering if like maybe they're attributing more power to the institution and the administration because of the current sociopolitical climate, and looking at like, well, there's the student orgs and people may be involved in activism, but then the institution is saying nothing.
Yes.
And I was wondering if you felt like, the sociopolitical moment kind of highlighted that role of the institution more or less, and if there were maybe other parts of the institution that you may have left out of this, but that also came up, like their professors, and you did talk about the classroom climate more, but
that's a good question.
Yeah,
and I think a lot of things came up around this,
Yeah.
and I think that's why it was kind of difficult to focus in on some, but some students did talk about, especially in the regional campuses, of the importance of having a faculty that spoke Spanish, or just more having that close-knit environment made them feel more comfortable to ask for support or ask for help. And then you mentioned kind of like how current events kind of pointed them to like what is the role of the institution, kind of what was I gonna say? Sorry. I think that came up a lot around not only the ICE raids and deportations, but also around activism in general. A lot of the students brought up like protesting, how that's kind of like only certain things are allowed to be protested, but not others. And I think another common theme was just like the only people looking out for students are students. So some students were more angry about how the university was handling things, and others were more neutral, or they said they didn't need any more support. So it was very mixed, but I think more so leaning towards wanting more support from the university. I hope that answers your question.
No, yeah,
Okay.
I think it's so interesting.
Yeah.
That makes me think about like if they have any like stress about being able to be active or not, right? Because I know for myself, my husband being an immigrant and in the process of his paperwork, it's really hard for me to feel confident to do any kind of activism because of all of that. Not that I feel like anybody, God forbid, like called immigration and was like, oh, this, you should check in this process. But like anything I do reflects on that process. So it's like, I do feel, I carry a lot of guilt about not being active. And so like for these students, especially if they're first or second, right? Or if they're second and they have status, depending on family status, right? Too. Like, how do they feel? And that could be like another added layer. Sorry, that's just.
No, that makes a lot of sense. They didn't really bring it up in the context of like protesting or activism, but I can see why they might link the two because they already expressed like fears around just being targeted for the color of their skin or the way that they look. So I don't think so.
Like, how do you keep safe while also wanting to like speak out?
Yeah, and I think that also reminds me of like the social media use. A lot of that sometimes came up when talking about the current political climate. Like some students were expressing just like they felt like posting on social media wasn't enough and that they wanted to, that they wanted others to kind of be more involved in kind of this activism. But yeah, maybe that is why that there's not more of it.
Are those on regional campuses or Storrs campus? I'm just curious as to which students are saying there should be more activism or more faculty involvement or more administrative response.
I think it was across all. It wasn't like one or the other. I think I've heard from some regional and some Storrs students the same kind of thing. And I'm trying to remember. Yeah, I think that they also, the students in the regional campuses also expressed wanting more resources from the university. Yeah, which is interesting. I don't really know what communication students are receiving, but yeah.
One of the things this is wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing your preliminary findings and your research process. One of the things that I'm always super curious about is the university of any university, but here at UConn, the university students that identify as Latine, but that never have any contact with El Instituto, with PERLAC, with LCI, that are like in their neuro classes or whatever, just kind of like going about their lives. And I'm really curious about how their responses might be different, how they might be interrogating their identity in different ways, and how kind of like the sampling will shape your findings. I'm especially interested in this because like in other contexts, so I'm a historian as an additional librarian, and like histories of things like Jewish identity in Buenos Aires, historians have found really, really, really different values between what they call institutionalized Jewish groups and non-institutionalized, like almost divergent values. So I'm really curious to see as your project expands with the quantitative work, and perhaps you get like a bigger sample size if you start to see those responses. So, but the flip side of that is then how do you reach those students that have like like the Brazilian grandma that they think about occasionally, or the like one parent that provides part of their identity, but they're kind of working between worlds. So like how do you reach those? Do you have ideas on how you're going to reach those students?
I think that's a really good question, and it just shows like the students who probably agreed to an interview are going to want to talk about these more. I'm hoping that with the survey and because it's more, I guess, private, that students will share more. But I guess in terms of reaching students who might not be more connected with these clubs and organizations, I think my goal is to kind of do a similar recruitment of reaching out to professors to share with their classes or just posting on campus, around campus, and reaching out to so I guess outside of the organization, the student works, I'm hoping that kind of gets at that. And then I'll also, with the quantitative part, I'll be able to see how they might be connected to their Latine identity versus other students who might have more connection. And I think a big piece of the quant survey that I'm adding is questions around campus climate and around, I forget the measure.
It's
But
Musea's culturally engaging campus environment scale, which is it has a lot of pieces around both the cultural piece and the campus.
Yeah.
It's used in higher ed a lot.
yeah, so I'm hoping that will kind of
Do we have an ERI
those-
measure, an ethnic racial identity measure? Not that we're adding, I don't want to, but
I think I did plan to add that in.
because we can get into this question of like how mature is their identity as a Latina or not? Could be, there's going to be a lot of analysis when you are, well, after you've defended outside of these questions, but like that question of like where are people in their connection to their Latina identity and does that change something? It would be very interesting. Like we could capture that in the quant.
An ethnic identity.
In the ethnic identity scale.
Yeah. It'd be really interesting too, because you're collecting data around what year they are in college, if that changes over their time.
Yes.
In college, depending on what they're coming, like the school that they're coming from, or how they're engaging with those organizations.
Yeah.
So true.
That's I was interested in that too, which is why I asked them like, how has their Latina identity, like, has it been, how do they feel more connected to it or less? And that's where a lot of pieces around like ethnic identity came up. And I do think there was a difference between like students who were later on in their fourth year versus earlier on. Those are great questions. Thank you.
Can I ask a follow-up too?
Yeah,
the other
course.
question I'm really interested about, and this might not be within the scope of your projects, but as you're describing the cultural values, I was also thinking about if for like later stages, if you were considering collecting any information about their sense of religiosity, because there seems to be like a Venn diagram of like overlapping cultural values, and especially around like ideas of gender. That might be super interesting to find out how they're envisioning their relationship with that. And involved with that.
That's a good point. I think so there's a Familismo measure, and I think that kind of gets at religiosity. So I'm hoping that I'll be able to see kind of the intersection. And I think you bring up a good point about how some of these overlap. And I think even when students were describing it, they would kind of overlap them anyway, like Familismo and Respeto and all of those. So it's really interesting. Thank you.
I don't know if you want to see if Caitlin's on. I have a feeling she had a 1 o'clock meeting, but sure.
That's okay.
What are you most excited for the quant scale?
I think asking the questions around the sociopolitical climate I'm excited about, because I think that's really, as I mentioned, the piece that a lot of the existing approach to stress measures don't get at. So I think kind of looking at those like also in relation to each other, like seeing which ones are more of a source of stress in more of a quantitative way, I think will be really interesting and a good contribution. And I guess, I mean, I was really excited mostly for the interviews to kind of talk with students, but I'm excited like around the implications for what this work means for like broader research, but also for UConn. I think it's really important because they're UConn students. So yeah.
Have you thought about sharing your results with student orgs? Like
I did in my
at UConn?
That's a good question.
The students could use it maybe.
That's a good point. I think in my IRB I did state that I would share that with students, but I didn't mention sorry, the org. But I think if they're interested and they wanted it, I would be happy to kind of give some takeaways or like key findings. That's a good point.
A little bit of that, what Julia was saying, like it's so powerful what you have here, like with the students, and like it's like tangible, like evidence. Like I think we all know, like students need spaces to talk, students want to talk about the political climate and like how stressful it is to pretend everything is okay. But like you have like facts, like you have like a study to like say like here's my evidence, like here's the evidence like on paper through interviews, through like a rigorous study. Like so I think you have a lot of good stuff here.
Yeah, I would be excited to share with whoever is interested.
Also, like considering like the fact that like we just came out of a pandemic, right? And that was stressful. And most of these students were in school during COVID,
Yeah.
either in high school or like starting college, right?
Mm-hmm.
And having to go through that. And then now this sociopolitical that's more impacting like their specific culture, like ethnic racial identity, right? Or their groups. It's so, I feel like you're going to be touching a lot of things with your quant part as well regarding that, because it's such a weird moment that we're in historically, you know, for people and especially students, right? To go through this.
Yeah, just the buildup of all these different
Build up,
yeah. I think, I mean, it didn't come up, but it would be interesting to see where they were when COVID was happening.
Yeah.
I would love to see you present in the Metas class. Are you familiar with the Metas class?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard of it also from a lot of the students, but I didn't know that there's classes.
And Alfred, who just left, will be teaching it in the fall.
Oh, okay.
And but I have taught that class before, and I was thinking about the class because of all the articles they have to read about basically Latino identity in college, right, which the course is framed as a higher ed and student affairs course. The article that they most viscerally respond to is one called The Guilt of Success. I don't know if you're familiar with that article, but it talks about the tensions that Latino students feel in, okay, here I am on campus, but you know, I have younger siblings that really need a babysitter and I'm not there to help my parents. And I feel guilty that I'm up here. And at the same time, when I go home, then I'm criticized for being too uppity for everybody else and for using different words and vocabulary and, you know, just being all focused on me and how stuck up I am. And so students just that article resonated so strongly with them, and they all had something to share about feeling this tension between, I want to be home helping, and when I'm home, I'm also often not seen as one of the gang anymore. And this sort of incipient recognition of class, of the class separation that's sort of beginning. Right. And one of the challenges that I've seen my Latino students have over the years is, okay, now I'm getting a degree, but if I want to go to law school, am I going to come back and live in this neighborhood? Probably not. And so they don't understand that the class tension is so strong. They just start to feel alienated as they recognize that their career path may not take them right back to that same community to help, which is why they went to college in the first place, many of them, to help that community. But they're slowly starting to recognize, you know, I'm probably not going back to the barrio in Bridgeport if I become a lawyer. And what does that mean? So, yeah, I feel like class is one of the things we talk about the least with students, and they understand the least when it comes to sort of acculturative stress. And there's a great book that somebody wrote years ago whose father was a bricklayer at Columbia, and then he got into Columbia, and he wrote about the relationship between him and his father as they were both went to Columbia every day. His father to be a bricklayer. I forgot what it's called, but it was one of the first books, I think it was in the 90s, that really started to look at class tensions among first gen. Anyway.
Yeah, that definitely came up, the juggling of the responsibilities, but then also not feeling like the same when they went back home. But they did talk about like caring for siblings, and probably reflective of what your students were saying too. That came up a lot in the interviews. Yeah, I would be happy to talk if it's relevant to what they would be interested in, and maybe hearing from other UConn students, they might be like, well, this is how I'm feeling too. So yeah.
One of the things that Metas class is really good for is it helps students understand social science research, and that they themselves could survey their friends. Because just about every article that is read has to do with college student studies about college students speaking about their experiences, and they're like, I could do this. I could snowball sample my friend group. So it's useful for them to see somebody who's above them in the pipeline, who is like, yeah, I'm doing this, and it's my dissertation, and you can make a living at this, right? And this is important research, and we have to be the ones doing it.
And I think that kind of follows how I the trajectory I took, because I did a lot of programs where I was able to go to university and see what grad school was like. And then my older sister also is a PhD student, and she was the first one in my family to do that. So yeah, seeing her do that, and then yeah, me, like it kind of inspired me to do that too. Yeah.
By the way, keep your eyes out. There's another grad student starting this journey. Her name's Jade Garcia. I don't know if you've gotten an email from her yet. I said actually.
He did actually.
Yeah, I just
think
mentioned
2
you.
days ago I got an email.
But she's a PharmD, so she's getting her doctorate in pharmacy. So she has to do something pharmacy related, and she's Latina, and she's interested in studying mental health, mental illness, and Latina students, and how that correlates with medicine adherence for things like depression. So if Latinas aren't taking their medication for their depression, what's causing it? Is it about stress? Is it about money, insurance? So what is it that keeps them from taking their meds? So
Interesting.
anyway, just putting that out there. If she's basically looking to recruit Latinas willing to talk about mental health and medicine.
Well, there's also
So
stigma.
difficult population to capture.
To take, you know?
That's good.